History is a story written by the winners, the survivors, and sometimes even the liars. What if everything you thought you knew about the past was wrong? Imagine a world where Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, Napoleon wasn't actually short, and medieval people definitely knew the earth was round. Today, we're tearing down the classroom posters and burning the history book myths, because the truth is far more fascinating than the lies we've been told. Get ready to have your mind blown as we debunk 30 of the most stubborn historical misconceptions everyone still believes. By the time we're done, you'll never look at history the same way again. So buckle up, this is going to be a wild ride through the twisted, exaggerated, and downright fabricated tales we've accepted as fact for way too long. Now let's tackle one of the most iconic and entirely fictional images in history. When you picture a Viking, what comes to mind? A burly warrior with a horned helmet, right? Well, it's time to set the record straight. The idea that Vikings wore horned helmets is one of those myths that's been repeated so often, it feels like fact. But here's the truth, not a single piece of archaeological evidence supports it. Vikings never wore horned helmets into battle, so how did this myth take such a strong hold? The story begins in the 19th century, long after the Viking Age had ended. Romantic artists and composers of the time were fascinated by the Norse sagas, but they took plenty of creative liberties. One of the biggest offenders was Richard Wagner's opera The Ring of the Nibelung, which featured characters wearing horned helmets. Costume designer Carl Emil Doppler went wild with the idea, and suddenly, these dramatic horned headpieces became the go-to image for Vikings in popular culture. Painters followed suit, blending fantasy with history, and soon the myth was set in stone. But let's look at the facts. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of artifacts from Viking settlements, including actual helmets. And guess what? Not one of them has horns. The real helmets were simple, practical, and designed for protection, made of iron or leather with nose guards for extra defense in combat. Horns would have been nothing but a liability in battle, easy to grab, easy to knock off, and completely unnecessary. Vikings were expert fighters, not performers in a theatrical spectacle. Yet, even with the evidence staring us in the face, pop culture just can't let this myth go. Comic books, cartoons, and blockbuster movies still love slapping horns on Viking helmets because, let's be honest, it looks dramatic. Even major brands and sports teams have leaned into the imagery, cementing the myth in the public imagination. But now you know better. The next time you see a horned Viking helmet, you'll see it for what it really is, a 19th century invention, not a historical artifact. And with that, we've hacked our way through the first big misconception. But don't relax yet, there are plenty more myths waiting to be busted. Next up, we're taking on another legend that's been towering over history, quite literally, for centuries. Now, let's turn our attention to another towering figure, pun intended, whose reputation has been unfairly shrunk by history. Napoleon Bonaparte, the brilliant military strategist and emperor of France, is often remembered as a tiny man with an oversized ego, giving rise to the infamous Napoleon complex. But here's the truth, Napoleon wasn't actually short for his time. In fact, he was of perfectly average height. So why does this myth persist? Let's measure up the facts. The confusion starts with a mix-up between measurement systems. During Napoleon's era, France used the French foot, or pied de roi, which was slightly longer than the British imperial foot. When French records listed Napoleon's height as 5 feet 2 inches, British sources took that number at face value without converting it. But here's the kicker, 5 feet 2 inches in French units translates to roughly 5 feet 7 inches in British measurements. That puts Napoleon at about the same height as the average Frenchman of his time. The British, however, happily ran with the smaller number, fueling propaganda that painted him as a diminutive tyrant with a chip on his shoulder. And then there's the Napoleon complex stereotype, the idea that shorter men compensate for their height with aggression or ambition. Psychologists have debunked this time and again, showing no real link between height and personality traits. But the myth stuck, partly because it made for a convenient way to undermine Napoleon's legacy. Think about it: his military genius, his sweeping reforms, his rise from obscurity to emperor, all of it gets overshadowed by jokes about his height. It's a classic case of reducing a complex historical figure to a simplistic, almost cartoonish trope. What's even more ironic, some of Napoleon's contemporaries described him as imposing. His soldiers nicknamed him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, but this was likely a term of affection, not a dig at his stature. And let's not forget, he often surrounded himself with towering elite guards, which might have made him appear shorter by comparison. But the real takeaway: Napoleon's height had nothing to do with his accomplishments. The man reshaped Europe, modernized legal systems, and left a lasting mark on history, all without being unusually short. So why does this myth endure? Because it's irresistible. Short man with big ambitions. It fits a narrative we love to repeat, even when the facts say otherwise. But now you know the truth. Napoleon wasn't a pint-sized dictator. He was just a man of his time, albeit one who happened to change the course of history. And with that, we've stood tall against another historical misconception. But don't step away just yet, because our next stop takes us to a legendary structure that's been stretching the truth for centuries. Now let's journey from the battlefields of Europe to the vast landscapes of China, where another towering myth has taken root, one that stretches far beyond the ground. You've probably heard the claim that the Great Wall of China is so massive, it's the only human-made structure visible from space. It's a breathtaking idea, isn't it? But here's the reality: the Great Wall is not visible to the naked eye from space, and the myth itself is a fascinating tale of exaggeration and national pride. First, let's hear from the people who have actually been to space. Astronauts, including those from NASA, have repeatedly confirmed that the Great Wall isn't visible without aid. From low Earth orbit about 200 miles up, structures like highways, airports, and even large cities can sometimes be spotted, but the Great Wall's narrow width and colors blend seamlessly into the surrounding terrain. It's made largely of earth and stone, materials that don't stand out against China's natural landscape. Even China's own astronaut, Yang Luwei, admitted he couldn't see it during his mission in 2003. Satellite imagery tells the same story. While high-resolution cameras can pick it up, the human eye simply can't distinguish it from above. So why does this myth persist? The story starts long before space travel. In the 1700s, European visitors to China, awestruck by the wall's scale, began exaggerating its visibility. Some claimed it could be seen from the moon, an idea that took hold despite lacking any scientific basis. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the myth was reinforced by schoolbooks and pop culture, eager to celebrate the wall as a singular marvel. Even today, the idea endures because it feels right. The Great Wall is staggering, stretching over 13,000 miles, weaving through mountains and deserts. It's a testament to human ambition, so we want it to be visible from space. But here's the twist: the myth's resilience reveals more about us than about the wall. We're drawn to stories that make the unimaginable seem tangible. The truth that the wall is an earthly wonder, not a cosmic one, doesn't diminish its grandeur. It's still one of history's most astonishing feats of engineering, built over centuries to protect empires, and that's the real takeaway. You don't need to see it from space to appreciate its scale. Stand at its base and you'll feel its power just as deeply. Now that we've grounded this sky-high myth, let's turn to another misconception, one that's kept the Middle Ages in the shadows for far too long. Moving from the towering myths of China, let's voyage back to medieval Europe, where a surprisingly modern misconception has stubbornly clung to history books: the idea that people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat. It's a tale that paints the past as ignorant, but the truth is far more nuanced. Here's the reality: by the medieval period, educated Europeans knew the earth was round. This wasn't some radical idea, it had been established science since ancient Greece. Thinkers like Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE and Aristotle a couple hundred years later provided compelling evidence for a spherical earth, from the curvature of shadows during lunar eclipses to ships disappearing hull first over the horizon. Even early Christian scholars like the 6th century monk Cosmas Indicopoulos, who did argue for a flat earth, were outliers. The vast majority of medieval scholars, including heavyweights like Thomas Aquinas and Bede, accepted the earth's roundness as fact. Universities taught it, navigators relied on it, and the church had no objection. So how did the flat earth myth take hold? Blame 19th century writers, particularly Washington Irving's fictionalized biography of Columbus. In his 1828 book, Irving dramatized Columbus's voyage by inventing a showdown with backward-thinking clerics who insisted the earth was flat. The scene was pure fiction. Columbus's real debate with scholars was over the size of the earth, not its shape. They worried his ships would run out of supplies before reaching Asia, which, incidentally, they nearly did. But Irving's version stuck, amplified by later anti-religious writers who wanted to paint the Middle Ages as a time of superstition stifling progress. The irony: the myth itself is a perfect example of how history gets flattened literally. We simplify the past to fit tidy narratives, whether it's enlightened moderns versus ignorant medievals or brave Columbus defying the establishment. The real story is messier and far more interesting. Medieval scholars debated plenty, just not the Earth's shape, and Columbus, his journey was a mix of grit, luck, and miscalculation, not a triumph over flat earthers. Next time you hear someone dismiss the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, remember this: they gave us eyeglasses, mechanical clocks, and Gothic cathedrals, feats that required a very rounded understanding of the world. Speaking of mislabeled eras, let's tackle another one: the so-called Dark Ages themselves. Now, let's whisk ourselves away to the glittering courts of 18th century France, where one of history's most infamous misquotes has painted a queen as heartless for centuries. The phrase, "let them eat cake," supposedly uttered by Marie Antoinette upon hearing the peasants had no bread, is a masterclass in how propaganda can distort history. Here's the twist: Marie Antoinette never said those words. The earliest known version of this quote appears in philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1766, when Marie Antoinette was just 10 years old and still living in Austria. Rousseau attributed the heartless remark to an unnamed great princess, long before the young queen even arrived in France. By the time Marie Antoinette became a controversial figure, revolutionaries dusted off the anecdote and slapped her name on it, turning it into a symbol of aristocratic indifference. But why did it stick? Marie Antoinette was already a lightning rod for public anger. As a foreigner, an Austrian Habsburg, she was viewed with suspicion, and her lavish spending, though often exaggerated, made her an easy target. The quote became a weapon, shorthand for the monarchy's disconnect from the suffering of the poor. In reality, Marie Antoinette's actual recorded words about famine were far more compassionate. In a letter to her mother in 1775, she expressed genuine concern, writing, "It is quite certain that in seeing the people who treat us so well despite their own misfortune, we are more obliged than ever to work hard for their happiness." The irony is that while the cake myth portrays her as callous, historical records show she was unusually charitable for a queen of her time. She personally funded orphanages, donated to widows, and even adopted impoverished children. None of this erased her political missteps, of course, but it paints a far more nuanced picture than the villainous caricature. This myth endures because it serves a narrative, the decadent aristocrat blind to the struggles of the masses. But history is rarely so black and white. The next time you hear this quote, remember, it's not just a misattribution, but a reminder of how easily words can be twisted to fit a story. And speaking of twisted tales, let's untangle another one, the idea that the Dark Ages were a time of total stagnation. Shifting our focus to another era often misunderstood, let's tackle the myth that the Dark Ages were a bleak void of progress. This idea of a stagnant, backward period is one of history's most persistent misconceptions, but the truth, the so-called Dark Ages were anything but dark. The term itself is a misnomer, coined by Renaissance scholars like Petrarch, who viewed the Middle Ages as a disappointing gap between the glory of ancient Rome and their own enlightened era. They painted the period as a time of ignorance, war, and cultural decay, but this couldn't be further from reality. In fact, the medieval period saw remarkable innovations that laid the groundwork for modern Europe. Take agriculture, for example. The heavy plow, introduced around the 6th century, revolutionized farming by allowing crops to thrive in Europe's dense, clay-rich soils. This wasn't just a small upgrade, it triggered a population boom. Then came the 3-field system, which replaced the outdated 2-field rotation. By dividing land into 3 parts, one for winter crops, one for summer, and one left fallow, farmers could produce more food while preserving soil health. These advancements didn't just feed people, they fueled economic growth and trade networks that spanned continents. Architecture, too, flourished in ways that still awe us today. The towering cathedrals of the Middle Ages weren't just religious symbols, they were marvels of engineering. The development of the pointed arch and flying buttress allowed builders to create structures with soaring ceilings and vast stained glass windows, flooding interiors with light. This wasn't stagnation, it was ingenuity. Even castles, often seen as crude fortresses, evolved into sophisticated complexes with advanced defenses, heating systems, and even early plumbing. Philosophy and learning didn't grind to a halt either. While it's true that some classical knowledge was lost or neglected, medieval scholars preserved and expanded upon it. Universities like Bologna and Oxford emerged during this time, becoming hubs of intellectual debate. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas blended ancient Greek philosophy with Christian theology, creating frameworks that shaped Western thought for centuries. Meanwhile, Islamic scholars in places like Al-Andalus translated and built upon Greek and Roman texts, ensuring their survival and eventual reintroduction to Europe. So why does the myth of the Dark Ages endure? Partly because of Renaissance propaganda. Scholars eager to glorify their own era cast the preceding centuries as a wasteland to make their achievements seem more dramatic. Later, Enlightenment thinkers doubled down on this narrative to contrast their Age of Reason with the superstition of the past. Even today, pop culture loves the imagery of a grim, backward Middle Ages. Think mud-covered peasants and torch-lit dungeons, because it makes for dramatic storytelling. But history is rarely so simple. The medieval period was a time of vibrant change where societies adapted, innovated, and laid the foundations for the modern world. The next time someone calls it the Dark Ages, you'll know better. And speaking of misunderstood labels, let's unravel another one, the myth that Salem's accused witches were burned at the stake. Now let's turn from myths about progress to myths about punishment specifically. The chilling misconception that Salem's accused witches met their end in flames. Hollywood loves a dramatic witch burning with screaming victims and towering pyres. But the truth about Salem's infamous trials is far more nuanced and in some ways even darker. First, the hard facts. Of the 20 people executed during the Salem witch trials in 1692, 19 were hanged and one, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones, a brutal method used to force a plea. Not a single person was burned at the stake in Salem. So where did the fiery myth come from? The confusion stems from Europe's witch hunts, where burning was indeed a common punishment, especially in regions like Germany and France. There, authorities saw witchcraft as heresy, a spiritual crime, and fire was thought to purify the soul. But in the American colonies, witchcraft was treated as a civil offense, punishable by hanging, just like theft or murder. The Salem trials also stand out for their sheer speed and chaos. Unlike Europe's drawn-out inquisitions, Salem's hysteria erupted and faded within a single year. Accusations flew wildly, often based on spectral evidence, the idea that a witch's spirit could torment victims invisibly. This let people testify that they'd been attacked by someone's ghostly form, even if the accused was miles away. The trials became a perfect storm of superstition, land disputes, and teenage girls' accusations, with entire families torn apart. Hollywood, of course, couldn't resist spicing things up. Films like The Crucible or Hocus Pocus mashed together European and American witch lore, showing flames and stakes where there were none. Even the iconic imagery of pointy black hats and broom-riding crones. Mostly inventions of later artists and writers, the real accused witches of Salem were ordinary people, farmers, healers, even a former minister wearing the same plain clothes as their neighbors. What's perhaps most haunting is how the trials ended. As the body count grew, doubts crept in. When accusations reached the colony's elite, including the governor's own wife, the court suddenly questioned the reliability of spectral evidence. By mid-1693, the hysteria had collapsed, leaving a legacy of shame. In the years that followed, survivors and families sought apologies, and one judge even publicly repented. But the damage was done, a stark reminder of how fear and rumor can twist justice into something monstrous. So why does the burning myth persist? It's partly because fire feels more primal, more cinematic. But the real story of hangings, pressed stones, and a community unraveling is no less gripping, and it serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mob mentality, one that echoes far beyond Salem. Speaking of justice gone awry, let's examine another myth, this time about who really discovered America. Now, shifting our gaze from the trials of Salem to the tales of exploration, we arrive at one of history's most stubborn myths, the idea that Christopher Columbus discovered America. This claim isn't just inaccurate, it erases millennia of indigenous history and overlooks earlier transatlantic voyages. Let's set the record straight. First, the obvious. When Columbus landed in the Bahamas in 1492, the Americas were already home to thriving civilizations. From the towering cities of the Aztecs and the Inca to the complex societies of the Mississippian culture, millions of people had built nations, trade networks, and cultural traditions long before European ships arrived. Columbus didn't stumble upon an empty continent. He encountered a world as rich and varied as Europe itself. But what about other explorers? Centuries before Columbus, Norse explorer Leif Erikson reached North America around the year 1000, establishing a short-lived settlement in present-day Newfoundland. Archaeological evidence at Elance Ox Meadows confirms Viking presence, complete with artifacts like iron nails and Norse-style buildings. Yet Eriksson's voyage, too, was a footnote in a much longer story. Indigenous peoples had been crossing between continents for generations, with trade routes stretching from the Arctic to the Andes. Here's the twist: Columbus never even set foot on mainland North America. His 4 voyages took him to the Caribbean and Central America, yet he died believing he'd reached Asia. The very name America comes from Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who later mapped South America's coastline and realized it was a separate continent. So why does Columbus get the credit? Much of it stems from 19th century nationalism, when American writers elevated him as a symbol of European ingenuity, ignoring both indigenous histories and earlier explorers like Eriksson. The myth also glosses over the darker side of Columbus's legacy. His arrival kicked off centuries of colonization, violence, and disease that devastated indigenous populations. Celebrating him as a discoverer whitewashes this brutal reality. Modern scholarship increasingly emphasizes the perspectives of native communities whose ancestors were here long before and long after European contact. So how did this myth take hold? It's a mix of outdated textbooks, patriotic storytelling, and the simple fact that Columbus's voyages did permanently link Europe and the Americas for better or worse. But history is richer when we acknowledge its full complexity. The Americas weren't discovered, they were already home, and that's a truth worth remembering. With that in mind, let's turn to another misunderstood artifact of history, the idea that the Iron Maiden, that spiked coffin of nightmares, was a medieval torture device. Prepare to uncover how a clever hoax fooled us for centuries. Now, stepping away from the myths of exploration into the world of medieval legends, let's tackle one of history's most chilling and completely fabricated horrors, the Iron Maiden. This spiked coffin-like contraption, often depicted as a favorite tool of medieval torment, is pure fiction. Yet its grip on popular imagination is so strong that even museums once displayed it as real. How did this grisly myth take root? The truth is more surprising than the fiction. The Iron Maiden as we know it, a human-sized cabinet lined with spikes that impaled the victim when closed, wasn't dreamed up in the Middle Ages at all. Its origins trace back to the late 18th century, when a German historian named Johann Philipp Siebenkees spun a tall tale about a notorious Nuremberg criminal executed in 1515 using a spiked iron virgin. Problem is, no historical records from that era mention such a device, and Siebenkees provided no credible sources. It was likely a sensational story meant to entertain rather than inform. But the myth snowballed. In the early 19th century, as Gothic fascination with the dark Middle Ages peaked, museums across Europe began constructing and displaying Iron Maidens as genuine medieval artifacts. One infamous example, the Nuremberg Iron Maiden, was proudly exhibited in the 1800s as a relic of the city's brutal past. Only later did experts realize it was a pastiche of parts from different eras. Some spikes were even repurposed farm tools. The artifact was a Frankenstein's monster of historical fakery. So why did people believe it? The answer lies in the Renaissance caricature of the Middle Ages as a backward, cruel time. Writers and artists eager to contrast their enlightened era with the so-called Dark Ages exaggerated or invented tales of barbaric torture. The Iron Maiden became a symbol of this fabricated savagery despite the lack of evidence. In reality, medieval torture devices were brutal but far simpler. Think racks or thumb screws, not elaborate death machines requiring blacksmithing genius. Archaeology further debunks the myth. Not a single Iron Maiden has ever been found in a medieval context. The few that exist date to the 18th or 19th centuries, often with telltale anachronisms like precision-engineered hinges or overly theatrical designs. Even the spikes defy logic. Real torture devices aim to prolong pain, not deliver instant death, which the Iron Maiden spikes would arguably do. Perhaps the most ironic twist. The Middle Ages had strict laws against torture in many regions, with trials often requiring confessions to be given freely, no coercion allowed. The Iron Maiden myth, then, isn't just a historical error, it's a distortion that paints an entire era with a cartoonish brush. As we close this chapter, remember, history's true horrors need no embellishment. The next time you see an Iron Maiden in a museum or movie, you'll know it's more fantasy than fact. And speaking of misunderstood artifacts, let's turn to another legendary site shrouded in myth, the Library of Alexandria, and the fiery tale of its destruction. Shifting our focus from fabricated horrors to legendary losses, the story of the Library of Alexandria's destruction is another historical myth that's been oversimplified for dramatic effect. Contrary to popular belief, this ancient wonder wasn't wiped out in a single, fiery catastrophe. Its downfall was far more gradual, tangled in a web of accidents, neglect, and political upheaval. The tale of Julius Caesar accidentally burning the library during his siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE is the version most people know. According to this narrative, flames spread from ships in the harbor to the library, consuming its priceless scrolls in one tragic night. But historians have long debated the scale of this event. While Caesar's fire likely damaged parts of the library, evidence suggests the majority of its collections survived. The library was part of a larger scholarly complex, the Mausoleum, which continued operating for centuries after Caesar's time. So when did the library truly fade away? The answer involves multiple blows over hundreds of years. In the 3rd century CE, Emperor Aurelian's forces sacked Alexandria during a revolt, possibly damaging the library's annexes. Then, in the late 4th century, Christian riots targeting pagan institutions may have further depleted its holdings. By this time, the library was already a shadow of its former self. Chronic underfunding and shifting priorities had led to neglect. Scrolls weren't copied or preserved as they once were, and many were dispersed to smaller collections. The final nail in the coffin likely came with the Arab conquest of Alexandria in the 7th century. The oft-repeated story that Caliph Omar ordered the library's contents burned as fuel for bathhouses is almost certainly a myth fabricated centuries later by writers with political agendas. In reality, the library had already dwindled to insignificance by then. Its decline wasn't the work of a single villain or event, but a slow erosion fueled by changing rulers, religious conflicts, and fading interest in preserving its vast knowledge. Why does the single fire myth persist? It's a classic case of history favoring simple, dramatic stories over messy truths. The image of flames devouring humanity's collective wisdom in one night is far more cinematic than the reality of bureaucratic decay. But the library's true story is just as compelling, a cautionary tale about how easily knowledge can slip away when societies stop valuing it. As we move forward, let's examine another misunderstood chapter of history, one where the wild reputation of the American West gets a much-needed reality check. Turning our attention to the rugged landscapes of the American frontier, let's tackle one of history's most enduring myths, the idea that the Wild West was a lawless free-for-all, where outguns ruled and justice was scarce. This dramatic image, shaped by Hollywood and sensationalized dime novels, couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, the West had a surprising amount of order, with established legal systems, marshals, and community-driven justice that kept chaos in check. The myth of the lawless West took root in the late 19th century, thanks to pulp fiction and exaggerated newspaper stories. Writers like Ned Buntline and Buffalo Bill Cody spun tales of gunfights at high noon and bandits running amok, turning frontier towns into stages for drama. But dig into the historical record and you'll find a different story. Most settlements had functioning courts, sheriffs, and even citizen-led vigilance committees to maintain peace. Take Dodge City, Kansas, famously dubbed the wickedest little city in America. Despite its rowdy reputation, records show it had a lower homicide rate than modern-day New York City. Marshals like Wyatt Earp, often portrayed as lone gunslingers, were actually lawmen who relied on warrants, trials, and community support to enforce order. So where did the violence narrative come from? Much of it stemmed from a handful of highly publicized events, like the gunfight at the O.K. Corral, which were exceptions, not the rule. In truth, many frontier towns had strict gun control laws. Places like Tombstone and Deadwood required visitors to check their firearms at the town limits, and brawls were more likely to end with fines or jail time than bloodshed. Even notorious outlaws like Billy the Kid were pursued through legal channels. Wanted posters listed bounties authorized by judges, not vigilante mobs. Community justice also played a vital role. Mining camps and cattle towns often formed their own ad hoc courts to settle disputes, and while these systems weren't perfect, they reflected a collective desire for stability. Lynchings, though occasionally occurring, were widely condemned by newspapers and local leaders as failures of the legal system, not the norm. The West's real story is one of pragmatism, settlers building institutions to protect their livelihoods, not anarchy. The persistence of the lawless West myth speaks to our love of rugged individualism and moral simplicity. It's easier to imagine a world of clear-cut heroes and villains than the messy reality of paperwork and town councils. But the truth is far more fascinating, a frontier where people worked hard to create order in the face of isolation and hardship. Next up, we'll uncover another myth, this time about the hands that built one of the ancient world's most iconic structures. Now, let's journey from the dusty trails of the Wild West to the sun-baked sands of ancient Egypt, where another long-held myth has stubbornly persisted: the idea that the pyramids were built by the brutal labor of slaves. This image, popularized by Hollywood epics and even some history textbooks, paints a grim picture of whip-cracked workers toiling under the scorching sun. But the truth, uncovered through decades of archaeological discoveries, tells a far different story. The myth traces back to the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BC, long after the pyramids were constructed. His account described 100,000 slaves straining under Pharaoh's tyranny to build the Great Pyramid. But here's the twist: Herodotus wasn't an eyewitness. He relied on second-hand stories, often embellished or misinterpreted. Modern archaeology has thoroughly debunked his narrative. Excavations near the Giza Plateau have revealed worker villages, complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities, hardly the amenities you'd provide to enslaved laborers. The real builders were skilled, paid workers who took pride in their craft. Graffiti found inside the pyramids includes phrases like "the friends of Khufu" or "the drunkards of Menkaure," suggesting camaraderie among crews. Even more telling are the burial sites uncovered nearby. These workers were buried with honor, some with beer and bread for the afterlife, and their bones show signs of medical care like healed fractures. One skeleton even had a surgical amputation, proof these workers were valued, not disposable. So why did Herodotus's version stick? Partly because it fit a convenient narrative. Later cultures, from the Romans to Victorian-era scholars, projected their own views of forced labor onto ancient Egypt. The Bible story of Hebrew slaves, written centuries after the pyramids, added to the confusion. But the pyramids weren't symbols of oppression. They were massive public works projects akin to modern infrastructure programs, employing thousands of skilled laborers who rotated in and out during the Nile's annual floods when farming was impossible. Pay records on papyrus scrolls detail wages in bread, beer, and onions, a standard compensation system. Some workers even went on strike, leaving behind petitions for better rations, something unthinkable for slaves. The pyramids, then, weren't built on cruelty but on a sophisticated economy and social organization. The persistence of the slave myth speaks to our tendency to simplify the past. It's easier to imagine a single tyrant commanding armies of slaves than a complex society where labor was organized, respected, and even celebrated. But the evidence doesn't lie. The pyramids stand not as monuments to suffering, but to human ingenuity and cooperation. Next, we'll unravel another historical exaggeration, one that reshaped how we view a famous financial disaster. Shifting from the grandeur of ancient Egypt to the glittering towers of Wall Street, let's tackle one of the most dramatic myths of the 20th century, the idea that the 1929 stock market crash triggered a wave of suicides, with distraught bankers leaping from skyscrapers. This grim imagery, immortalized in films and pop culture, paints a visceral picture of despair. But like so many historical misconceptions, the truth is far less sensational and far more revealing about how myths take hold. The legend stems from a perfect storm of media exaggeration and public anxiety. In the weeks following the crash, newspapers ran lurid headlines like "Wall Street lays an egg" and "Brokers jump like rats." One widely circulated anecdote described a hotel clerk asking a guest if he needed a room for sleeping or jumping. These stories were gripping, but they weren't backed by data. In reality, New York City's suicide rate in 1929 was lower than in 1928, and the year after the crash saw only a modest increase. The medical examiner's office recorded just 2 suicides linked directly to stock losses in late October 1929, neither involving a window. So why did the myth stick? Blame it on the era's tabloid culture. The 1920s were the golden age of yellow journalism, where papers competed for eyeballs with shocking and often fabricated stories. The crash was a seismic event, and tales of financial ruin paired with high-profile deaths made for irresistible copy. When a well-known investor like Jesse Livermore took his own life years later in 1940, his tragic end was retroactively tied to 1929, cementing the narrative. Even Broadway and Hollywood got in on the act, with films like The Roaring Twenties showing brokers plunging to their deaths. Digging deeper, the suicide myth also served a political purpose. Critics of capitalism used it to underscore the cruelty of speculation, while reformers pointed to it as proof of Wall Street's recklessness. The imagery of falling bankers became shorthand for the excesses of the era, overshadowing more nuanced conversations about economic policy. The truth is, most investors in 1929 weren't wealthy brokers but ordinary Americans who'd bought stocks on margin. Their suffering was quieter but no less real: bankruptcies, foreclosures, and breadlines. The real tragedy of the crash wasn't fictionalized leaps but the slow grind of poverty that followed. By fixating on the myth, we've overlooked the resilience of those who rebuilt their lives and the systemic reforms that emerged from the crisis, like the Securities and Exchange Commission. Next time you see that dramatic stock market crash scene in a movie, remember, history is rarely as simple as a headline or a Hollywood ending. Up next, we'll untangle another myth, this one about a famous document that didn't quite free who you think it did. Now, let's turn the page from Wall Street's myths to one of the most misunderstood moments in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. This landmark document is often celebrated as the definitive end of slavery in the United States, but the reality is far more complicated. First, let's clarify what the Emancipation Proclamation actually did and didn't do. When President Abraham Lincoln issued it on January 1, 1863, it declared enslaved people in Confederate states forever free. Sounds sweeping, right? But here's the catch. It only applied to states in rebellion, not to slave-holding Union states like Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, or even to Confederate areas already under Union control. That means hundreds of thousands of enslaved people remained legally bound in those regions. Lincoln's primary goal wasn't just abolition. It was to weaken the Confederacy by destabilizing its labor force and rallying international support for the Union cause. So why do so many of us believe it freed all enslaved people? Blame oversimplified history lessons. Textbooks often frame the proclamation as Lincoln's grand moral stand, glossing over its strategic wartime purpose. This myth persists because it fits a tidy narrative of progress, a single heroic act ending an evil institution. But the truth is messier. The proclamation was a military tool as much as a moral one, and its immediate impact depended on Union troops actually enforcing it as they advanced. Many enslaved people in the South didn't learn of their freedom until months or even years later. The real end of slavery came with the 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, nearly 3 years after the proclamation. This amendment abolished slavery everywhere in the U.S., closing the loopholes left by Lincoln's order. Yet even then, freedom wasn't instant or absolute. Formerly enslaved people faced black codes, sharecropping systems, and violence like the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, systemic barriers that persisted for generations. The myth of the Emancipation Proclamation as a blanket freedom decree also obscures Lincoln's own political balancing act. He initially prioritized preserving the Union over ending slavery, and his views evolved over time. The proclamation was a calculated risk, one that alienated some Northerners while empowering abolitionists. Recognizing its limitations doesn't diminish its significance. It reveals how change often happens incrementally through a mix of idealism and pragmatism. By oversimplifying this history, we miss the courage of those who fought for their own freedom, like the thousands of enslaved people who fled to Union lines, forcing the government to confront the issue head-on. We also overlook the grueling legislative battles that followed, proving that justice isn't won with a single stroke of a pen. So next time you hear the Emancipation Proclamation credited as slavery's death knell, remember, history's turning points are rarely as simple as they seem. And speaking of oversimplifications, our next myth takes us to the gladiatorial arena, where Hollywood's blood-soaked spectacles couldn't be further from the truth. Shifting our focus from the battlefield to the arena, let's tackle one of Hollywood's most dramatic fabrications, the idea that gladiators were disposable warriors forced to fight to the death every time they stepped into the Colosseum. The truth, gladiators were far more like elite athletes than expendable pawns. First, consider the economics. Training a gladiator was a massive investment. These fighters were often slaves or prisoners, but their owners, called lanistae, spent small fortunes housing, feeding, and training them in specialized schools. Historical records show that top gladiators could cost the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today. Why would anyone throw away such a valuable asset in a single fight? Contracts from the Roman era reveal that most matches ended when one combatant was wounded or exhausted, not dead. In fact, inscriptions and medical studies of gladiator graves suggest the average fighter survived dozens of bouts, with mortality rates as low as 1 in 10. Now let's debunk Hollywood's bloodthirsty portrayal. Films like Gladiator and Spartacus show non-stop carnage, but real gladiatorial games were tightly regulated. Referees oversaw matches to enforce rules, and doctors were often on standby. Gladiators even had unions, yes, unions, that negotiated pay and conditions. The goal wasn't slaughter, it was spectacle. Crowds wanted to see skill and drama, much like modern boxing or MMA. Fights to the death did happen, but they were rare exceptions, usually reserved for political ceremonies or to punish criminals. So how did this myth take hold? Blame 19th century Romanticism and early cinema, which sensationalized Rome as a decadent empire drowning in blood. The exaggeration stuck because it fit a narrative of ancient brutality, one that ignored the gladiator's own agency. Many were volunteers seeking fame and fortune, and some even won their freedom. Emperor Commodus, famously depicted as a murderous villain, actually fought in rigged matches where his opponents used wooden swords. The real tragedy isn't the fictional body count, it's how this myth overshadows the gladiators' humanity. These weren't faceless killers, but individuals with complex lives. Graffiti in Pompeii cheers specific fighters by name, and tombstones boast of their careers like modern athletes. By reducing them to doomed warriors, we miss their resilience and even their celebrity. Next time you see a gladiator film, remember, the truth is less about gore and more about gamesmanship. And speaking of games, our next myth takes us to the high seas, where a famous ship's so-called unsinkable reputation wasn't quite what we've been told. Now let's set sail from the Roman arena to colonial America, where another myth has been steeped in patriotic legend, the real story behind the Boston Tea Party. Contrary to popular belief, this iconic act of defiance wasn't a simple rebellion against high taxes. It was a calculated strike against corporate greed and monopolistic control. The East India Company was the Amazon of its day, a corporate giant drowning in debt, yet wielding enough political influence to secure a bailout from the British government. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which granted the company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. Here's the twist: the act actually lowered the price of tea by removing middlemen. So why dump 46 tons of it into Boston Harbor? Because the colonists saw a bigger threat. By letting the East India Company undercut local merchants, Britain wasn't just taxing the colonies, it was strangling their economy. The protest wasn't about the cost of tea, it was about who controlled the trade. This is where the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," gets oversimplified. Yes, colonists resented taxes imposed by a distant parliament, but the Tea Party targeted something more immediate: a corporation exploiting political favors to crush competition. Imagine if today's small businesses watched a mega corporation get exclusive rights to sell coffee in their towns. The outrage wouldn't just be over taxes, it'd be over fairness. That's the spirit that fueled the Tea Party. Modern retellings often paint the event as a unified stand against British tyranny, but the reality was messier. Many wealthy colonists, including some founding fathers, opposed the destruction of property. Even John Adams, who championed the protest, called it bold and intrepid but admitted it crossed a legal line. Meanwhile, British authorities were less outraged by the principle than by the financial loss enough to trigger the harsh coercive acts, which only radicalized more colonists. So how did this nuanced protest become a myth about taxes? Blame 19th century textbooks and patriotic speeches that streamlined the story for easier digestion. The Tea Party made a sharper symbol as a tax revolt, even though its true target was corporate monopoly. Next time you see a reenactment with colonists ranting about high prices, remember, they weren't just mad about pennies on their tea. They were fighting to keep their economy out of a single company's grip. And that fight brings us to our next myth, where we'll see how another misunderstood event, the Salem Witch Trials, was far less about flames than Hollywood would have you believe. Moving from colonial protests to the everyday lives of medieval people, let's tackle another myth that's been unfairly plastered over history: the idea that the Middle Ages were a cesspool of grime and neglect. While Hollywood loves to depict peasants caked in dirt, the truth is, medieval hygiene was far more sophisticated than we've been led to believe. Take public baths, for example. Contrary to the filthy peasant stereotype, bathing was a regular part of life in many medieval towns. Cities like Paris and London boasted public bathhouses, some even offering steam rooms and massages. Records show that London had at least 18 bathhouses by the 12th century, proof that cleanliness wasn't just for the elite. People soaked in wooden tubs at home, too, often infused with herbs like lavender or rosemary for fragrance and health. Even monasteries, often painted as austere and dirty, had strict washing routines. Monks were required to wash their hands before meals and feet weekly, with full baths prescribed several times a year, standards that might surprise modern audiences. Grooming tools further debunk the myth. Archaeologists have unearthed combs, razors, and ear scoops from medieval sites, some intricately carved from bone or ivory. Toothpicks and mouth rinses made with vinegar or mint were common, and manuscripts even detail recipes for toothpaste using crushed charcoal and honey. Hair care was serious business. Women used herbal mixtures to lighten or condition their hair, while men trimmed beards with shears. The notion that everyone went around with matted hair and rotten teeth. That's more Victorian propaganda than historical fact. Sanitation laws reveal another layer of medieval conscientiousness. Towns enforced strict waste disposal rules. In 14th century London, dumping garbage in streets could land you a fine, and butchers were required to dispose of offal outside city walls. Some cities built elaborate drainage systems. York's Little River Foss was essentially a medieval sewer. Even the infamous chamber pot wasn't just dumped willy-nilly. Many homes had designated waste areas or used carts to collect it for fertilizer. So why does the dark and dirty myth persist? Blame later eras. Renaissance writers, eager to glorify their own time, painted the Middle Ages as backward. Then came 19th century reformers who exaggerated past filth to promote modern sanitation campaigns. Add in grim depictions from movies and books and voila, 1,000 years of history reduced to a grubby caricature. Next time you see a medieval film with mud-smeared extras, remember, the real Middle Ages were far more washed than we think. And that brings us to our next misconception, where we'll see how even the Titanic's so-called unsinkable reputation wasn't quite what we've been told. Now, shifting our focus from medieval hygiene to a maritime legend, let's dive into one of the most enduring myths about the Titanic, the idea that it was boldly marketed as unsinkable. This claim has been repeated so often it's taken as fact, but the truth is far more nuanced. The White Star Line, the company behind the Titanic, never actually called the ship unsinkable in their official materials. Instead, their brochures and advertisements used the far more cautious phrase practically unsinkable, a term rooted in the ship's advanced safety features. Engineers had designed the Titanic with 16 watertight compartments, a cutting-edge innovation at the time. The idea was that even if 4 compartments flooded, the ship would stay afloat. This led to confident but not reckless claims about its resilience. One magazine, Shipbuilder, did describe the Titanic and her sister ships as virtually unsinkable, but this was technical praise, not a public slogan. So how did the myth take hold? The answer lies in the aftermath of the disaster. In the days following the sinking, newspapers scrambled to explain how such a modern marvel could meet such a tragic end. Sensational headlines latched onto the unsinkable label to heighten the irony and drama. Articles like the New York Times' infamous Titanic sinks 4 hours after hitting iceberg amplified the narrative, with some even falsely quoting White Star Line officials as having called the ship unsinkable. The public's shock and grief made the exaggeration stick. It was easier to blame corporate hubris than to grapple with the complex realities of maritime safety. Even survivors' accounts played a role. Many passengers recalled hearing crew members or fellow travelers casually referring to the ship as unsinkable, but these were likely informal comments, not official statements. Over time, these whispers solidified into common knowledge. The myth was further cemented by later retellings, from books to films, which leaned into the unsinkable trope for dramatic effect. The lesson here: language matters. A single word practically versus absolutely can reshape history's memory of an event. The Titanic story isn't just about a ship, it's about how myths calcify in the public imagination, often overshadowing the truth. And speaking of overshadowed truths, our next misconception takes us from the high seas to the classroom, where a certain genius's math skills have been wildly misrepresented. Now, turning from maritime myths to a surprising classroom legend, let's tackle one of the most baffling misconceptions about genius Albert Einstein supposedly failing math in school. This myth has been repeated so often it's become a comforting anecdote for struggling students, but the truth is far more impressive. Einstein wasn't just good at math, he was exceptional. His school records from the Swiss Cantonal School in Aarau, where he studied at age 17, showed top marks in algebra, geometry, and physics. Even earlier, at the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich, he excelled in these subjects, consistently outperforming his peers. The idea that he struggled academically is pure fiction, and it's a myth Einstein himself found frustrating. In a 1935 letter, he explicitly refuted the claim, writing, "Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." Hardly the words of someone who flunked math. So where did this myth come from? The roots trace back to the 1930s, during a wave of anti-intellectual sentiment in Europe and America. A satirical article mocking intellectuals, likely inspired by political tensions, misrepresented Einstein's early education, claiming he'd been a poor student. The irony is that the article was meant to be humorous, but over time the joke was taken as fact. Newspapers and later pop culture ran with the story, turning it into a motivational tale about late bloomers. Even today, it's often repeated without scrutiny, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Part of the myth's persistence comes from conflating Einstein's frustrations with rigid schooling systems, not his actual abilities. He clashed with the rote memorization style of his early schools, preferring creative problem solving. But that's a critique of education methods, not his performance. By age 12, he was studying advanced physics textbooks on his own, and by 16, he'd written his first scholarly paper on the nature of light. Far from a struggling student, he was a prodigy whose curiosity outpaced traditional classrooms. The lesson here is twofold. First, myths often thrive when they fit a comforting narrative like the underdog overcoming early failure. Second, genius isn't always about defying expectations. Sometimes it's about recognizing excellence where it already exists. Einstein's real story isn't one of academic failure, but of relentless curiosity and independent thinking. And speaking of thinking differently, our next misconception takes us from the classroom to the courtroom, where another famous figure's reputation has been wildly distorted by history. Shifting from misunderstood genius to everyday myths, let's tackle a rule we've all heard, and maybe even followed, the so-called 5-second rule. You know the one. Drop a piece of food, snatch it up quickly, and declare it safe to eat because germs supposedly need more time to invade. It's a comforting idea, but here's the twist: this ancient wisdom isn't ancient at all. In fact, it's a modern invention with no roots in history, despite claims linking it to figures like Genghis Khan or medieval feasts. The 5-second rule, as we know it today, first popped up in the 1990s. It gained traction thanks to a combination of urban legends and a catchy mention in a popular television show, which presented it as common knowledge. But the idea that it stretches back centuries, pure fiction. There's zero evidence that Genghis Khan enforced a food-dropping grace period for his warriors, nor did medieval Europeans have any such rule in their hygiene practices. In reality, historical food safety was far more pragmatic and often brutal. Spoiled or contaminated food was discarded outright, with no leniency for timing. So why do so many people assume this rule has ancient origins? Part of it comes from our love of attaching old-world mystique to everyday habits. Medieval banquets and Mongol conquests sound more dramatic than a 90s sitcom, so the myth took on a life of its own. But the truth is, the 5-second rule is a perfect example of how modern pop culture can reshape our perception of history, inventing traditions where none existed. And let's talk science for a moment. Researchers have tested the 5-second rule repeatedly, and the results are clear: bacteria don't wait politely. The instant food hits the floor, contamination begins, especially on porous or damp surfaces. A study from Rutgers University found that transfer happens in less than a second, debunking the rule's core premise. Yet despite the evidence, the myth persists, proving just how stubbornly we cling to comforting ideas, even when they're provably wrong. What's fascinating here isn't just the rule's falseness, but why we want it to be true. It's a tiny rebellion against waste, a way to justify saving that last bite of something delicious. But history and science aren't on our side this time. The next time you're tempted to invoke the 5-second rule, remember, it's not a time-honored tradition, just a 90s urban legend with a surprisingly strong grip on our collective imagination. And speaking of gripping myths, our next misconception takes us from dropped food to a far darker legend, one involving medieval torture devices that never actually existed. Now, let's step away from myths about food and into the realm of fashion, specifically the iconic image of the pilgrims. You've probably seen the classic depiction: stern-faced figures dressed head to toe in black, topped off with those unmistakable buckled hats. It's a look burned into our collective memory, especially around Thanksgiving. But here's the surprising truth: this somber, monochrome wardrobe is almost entirely a fabrication. The real pilgrims, they wore color and plenty of it. Historical records, including wills, estate inventories, and merchant accounts, reveal a wardrobe far more vibrant than the drab stereotype. Pilgrim clothing featured deep greens, rich browns, warm reds, and even purples dyes made from plants, minerals, and imported materials like indigo. Buckles, too, were rare in their era. They became fashionable later in the late 17th century. So how did this misrepresentation take hold? Blame 19th century artists and writers who romanticized the pilgrims as austere, moralizing figures. Painters like George Henry Borton and writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne exaggerated the Puritan aesthetic to fit a narrative of piety and simplicity, ignoring the actual fashion of the time. In reality, pilgrim attire was practical and stylish. Men wore doublets, fitted jackets in earthy tones paired with breeches and stockings. Women sported petticoats and waistcoats, often layered with aprons and coifs, linen caps, not those towering, buckled hats. Even their shoes were colorful, dyed leather or fabric, not the plain black we imagine. The myth persists because it's visually striking and reinforces the idea of pilgrims as rigid, humorless pioneers. But the truth is far more human. They dressed like their contemporaries in England and Holland, embracing the colors and textiles available to them. This misconception matters because it flattens history into a caricature. By stripping away the pilgrims' real fashion, we lose sight of their culture's nuance, their trade connections, their social hierarchies, even their individuality. Next time you see that black and white Thanksgiving decoration, remember, the past was never so monotone. And speaking of colorful histories, our next myth takes us from fabric dyes to something far darker, a so-called medieval torture device that was never medieval at all. Now, shifting our focus from misunderstood fashion to a far more sinister legend, let's tackle the infamous Spanish Inquisition. Pop culture paints it as a blood-soaked reign of terror, with fanatical priests burning heretics at every turn. But the truth, it was far more bureaucratic and far less lethal than its reputation suggests. First, let's confront the numbers. Over its 300-year span, the Spanish Inquisition executed around 3,000 people. That's tragic, but compare it to secular courts in Europe during the same period. In England, Henry VIII oversaw nearly 60,000 executions. Witch trials in Germany claimed up to 25,000 lives. Even the Venetian Inquisition, often seen as moderate, had a higher per capita execution rate. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't uniquely brutal, it was typical for its era, just better documented. What made it seem so extreme? Meticulous record-keeping. Unlike other courts, the Inquisition documented everything: interrogations, trials, even acquittals. These archives survived, creating a paper trail that later historians misinterpreted as proof of exceptional cruelty. Meanwhile, secular trials left fewer records, letting their violence fade from memory. The Inquisition's reputation also suffered from Protestant propaganda. Anti-Spanish writers in England and the Netherlands exaggerated its brutality to paint Catholic Spain as a monstrous other. By the 19th century, novels and plays cemented this myth, ignoring the Inquisition's strict legal protocols. Speaking of protocols, accused heretics had rights unheard of in secular courts. They could name enemies who might have falsely accused them, demand proof of charges, and even appeal to Rome. Torture, it happened, but under strict limits: no permanent injury, no bloodshed, and was used in less than 5% of cases. Compare that to secular trials where torture was routine and unrestrained. The Inquisition's goal wasn't mass slaughter, it was conversion. Most confessed heretics received fines, pilgrimages, or public penance. Executions were last resorts, often for repeat offenders. This misconception matters because it distorts how we view religious violence. By fixating on the Inquisition, we overlook the secular brutality of the era, the witch hunts, the ethnic purges, the dynastic wars that killed millions. The Inquisition became a scapegoat, a symbol of medieval barbarity, when in reality it was a product of its time, no better but certainly no worse. So next time you hear someone joke, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition," remember, what they should expect is a sober reassessment of history's messy, complicated truths. And speaking of messy truths, our next myth takes us from feared tribunals to a beloved masterpiece whose fame wasn't always what we think. Now, let's turn from the shadows of the Inquisition to the spotlight of art history, where even the most iconic masterpiece wasn't always the star of the show. The Mona Lisa's smile might be instantly recognizable today, but for centuries this painting languished in obscurity. Believe it or not, Leonardo da Vinci's other works, like The Last Supper, overshadowed his enigmatic portrait during his lifetime and for hundreds of years after. So how did a modestly sized portrait of a Florentine merchant's wife become the face of Western art? The answer lies in a daring heist. In 1911, a handyman named Vincenzo Perugia walked out of the Louvre with the Mona Lisa tucked under his coat. The theft sent shockwaves through France, not because the painting was already famous, but because the Louvre's security was embarrassingly lax. Newspapers splashed the story globally, turning the missing artwork into a sensation. For 2 years, crowds flocked to the Louvre just to stare at the empty space where it once hung. When the painting was finally recovered in 1913, Perugia became a folk hero in Italy for returning it despite his motives being more financial than patriotic, and the Mona Lisa skyrocketed to mythic status. But before the theft, the painting was just there. Art critics of the 19th century rarely mentioned it. Napoleon briefly displayed it in his bedroom, but even then, it wasn't considered da Vinci's magnum opus. His Virgin of the Rocks and The Last Supper garnered far more admiration. The Mona Lisa's rise wasn't about artistic merit alone. It was about drama, nationalism, and the birth of modern media. The theft tapped into the public's love for scandal, and the painting's mysterious smile became a blank canvas for endless interpretation. Even Da Vinci might be baffled by its fame. He left the Mona Lisa unfinished, tinkering with it for years before abandoning it in his studio. His patron, Francesco del Giocondo, likely never received it. For centuries, it was just one of many Renaissance portraits until the perfect storm of crime, journalism, and public obsession transformed it into the cultural icon we know today. This misconception matters because it reveals how much fame depends on chance, not just genius. Masterpieces aren't born legendary, they're made by history's twists. And speaking of twists, our next myth takes us from stolen art to a very different kind of theft, one that reshaped an entire continent's destiny. Shifting from stolen art to a darker chapter of history, let's untangle the myths surrounding witch trials. You've probably heard the story. Wise women skilled in herbal medicine were hunted down by fearful authorities for their knowledge. It's a compelling narrative, one that's been embraced by modern retellings, especially feminist ones. But the truth, far more complicated and far less romantic. The reality is, most so-called witches weren't healers or midwives with secret botanical wisdom. In fact, historical court records reveal a stark pattern. Accusations overwhelmingly targeted society's most vulnerable elderly widows, the poor, outsiders, and those with physical or mental disabilities. Take the Salem trials. Of the 20 executed, nearly all were marginalized in some way. Sarah Good, for instance, was a homeless beggar. Bridget Bishop was a tavern keeper with a sharp tongue and multiple marriages, making her a social outlier. Their supposed witchcraft often had nothing to do with herbs and everything to do with being easy scapegoats during times of crisis, crop failures, disease outbreaks, or political instability. So where did the herbal healer myth come from? Largely from 19th and 20th century reinterpretations. Feminist scholars seeking to reclaim women's history sometimes painted accused witches as proto-scientists oppressed by a patriarchal church. While well-intentioned, this glosses over the grim truth. Witch hunts were less about suppressing knowledge and more about reinforcing social control. The actual charges, like cursing livestock or causing a neighbor's illness, rarely involved sophisticated herbalism. Instead, they played on superstitions about maleficium or harmful magic, often tied to petty grudges or economic rivalry. That's not to say herbal knowledge didn't play any role. In rare cases, like the trial of Scottish witch Agnes Sampson, midwifery or healing was mentioned, but even then, it was twisted into evidence of demonic pacts. The church's real fear wasn't medicine, it was unauthorized power, especially in women. A poor woman brewing a pain relief tonic, suspicious. A male apothecary selling the same remedy. Perfectly acceptable, the romanticized version of witch trials does a disservice to history's real victims. By framing them as martyrs for female wisdom, we risk ignoring the systemic cruelty that drove these persecutions: poverty, misogyny, and sheer bad luck. The next time you see a movie or book portraying witches as noble herbalists, remember, the past was messier and far more tragic than the myths suggest. And speaking of myths that distort reality, our next misconception takes us from witch hunts to a very different kind of legend, one that claims an entire era was shackled by ignorance. Now, let's step away from the shadows of witch trials and into a misconception that paints half the world in darkness, literally. The idea that the so-called Dark Ages were a universal slump in human progress is one of history's most persistent oversimplifications. Here's the truth. While Europe was navigating feudalism and fragmented kingdoms, other parts of the globe were flourishing with breakthroughs that would shape the modern world. Take the Islamic Golden Age, stretching from the 8th to the 14th centuries. While Europe's scholarly lights dimmed after the fall of Rome, cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo became beacons of innovation. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad wasn't just a library. It was a powerhouse where scholars translated Greek and Roman texts, advanced algebra thanks to Al-Khwarizmi, and pioneered optics. Ibn al-Haytham's work laid the groundwork for cameras. Hospitals with separate wards, surgical tools we'd recognize today, and even the concept of peer review emerged here. This wasn't darkness, it was a radiant chapter of human achievement. Meanwhile, in Tang Dynasty China 618 to 907, the world's most advanced civilization was hitting its stride. Think porcelain, gunpowder, and block printing centuries before Gutenberg. The Grand Canal, a marvel of engineering, linked the empire's rivers to fuel trade and unity. Poetry flourished under Lai Bai and Du Fu, while civil service exams promoted meritocracy over noble birth. Compare that to Europe's feudal struggles and it's clear the darkness was strictly regional. Then there's Mesoamerica. While Europe debated whether the Earth was flat, another myth we debunked earlier, the Maya were charting the stars with jaw-dropping precision. Their calendar, more accurate than Europe's at the time, tracked celestial cycles down to the minute. Cities like Tikal and Teotihuacan boasted pyramids, aqueducts, and bustling markets. Hardly the hallmarks of a backward era. So why does the Dark Ages label stick? Blame Renaissance thinkers like Petrarch, who framed their own era as a rebirth from medieval barbarism. Later, Enlightenment writers doubled down, using the term to contrast their enlightened age. But this Eurocentric view ignores a simple fact: the world is vast and progress isn't linear. What looked like stagnation in one region was elsewhere an era of thriving art, science, and governance. The next time you hear Dark Ages, remember, darkness depends on where you're standing. And speaking of misplaced shadows, our next myth hides in plain sight, on the pedestal of a famous statue. Now, let's sail across the Atlantic to uncover the truth behind one of America's most iconic symbols. Towering over New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty is often celebrated as a French gift commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. But history, as usual, is a bit more nuanced than the popular narrative suggests. The statue's origins trace back to the aftermath of the American Civil War. French abolitionist Édouard de Laboulaye conceived the idea in 1865, envisioning a monumental tribute to the Union's victory and the enduring friendship between France and the United States. Sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi brought the vision to life, designing "Liberty enlightening the world" as a symbol of shared democratic ideals, not specifically emancipation. The statue's torch, tablet, and broken chains later added to her feet represented broader concepts of freedom and progress, not a direct reference to slavery's abolition. Here's where the confusion creeps in. The statue's dedication in 1886 happened 2 decades after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the U.S. While Laboulaye and Bartholdi were staunch abolitionists, the project's timing and funding delays meant it couldn't have been primarily about celebrating emancipation. The broken chains, often cited as proof, were actually an afterthought. Bartholdi initially placed them discreetly at Liberty's feet, visible only from above, to avoid alienating Southern donors during Reconstruction. The emancipation connection gained traction much later, particularly during the 20th century civil rights movement. Activists reinterpreted the statue as a beacon for racial justice, and the iconic imagery of chains, though not part of Bartholdi's original focus, resonated powerfully with new generations. Even the poem at Liberty's base, "The New Colossus" by Emma Lazarus, wasn't added until 1883 and originally highlighted immigration, not slavery. So why does this myth endure? It's a comforting blend of patriotism and moral triumph. Linking liberty to emancipation simplifies a complex history, turning her into a shorthand for America's progress. But the real story of Franco-American solidarity, artistic evolution, and the messy timeline of freedom is far more compelling. As we step away from liberty's shadow, our next myth takes us from symbolic chains to very real and very misunderstood medieval contraptions. Shifting gears from monumental symbolism to intimate myths, let's tackle one of history's most bizarre and persistent fabrications, the so-called medieval chastity belt. Popular culture loves to depict these iron contraptions as tools of jealous knights or oppressive husbands, locking away their wives' virtue during the Crusades. But the truth, these devices were never strapped on in the Middle Ages. The real story begins centuries later, in the prudish imaginations of the 19th century. The myth's roots twist back to Renaissance satire, not medieval reality. Court jesters and writers like François Rabelais included exaggerated references to chastity belts in bawdy jokes, poking fun at jealousy and marital distrust. These were clearly fictional, no different than modern stand-up comedy riffing on overbearing partners. But fast forward to the 1800s and Victorian moralists took these jokes deadly seriously. Amid a panic about masturbation and moral decay, doctors and pseudoscientists rebranded the chastity belt as a medieval invention, claiming it had been used to enforce purity. Museums even displayed forged antique belts complete with rust and elaborate locks to lend credibility to the myth. Here's the smoking gun, zero archaeological evidence. Not a single genuine chastity belt has ever been found in a medieval excavation. The few surviving examples in museums all trace back to the 18th or 19th centuries, often with telltale anachronisms like machine-cut metal or modern locking mechanisms. Even medieval medical texts and legal records packed with bizarre treatments and laws never once mentioned these devices. If they'd been real, you'd expect at least one lawsuit over a rusty hinge or a botched key retrieval. So why does this idea cling on? It feeds a lurid fantasy of the Middle Ages as a backward era of control, contrasting with our enlightened modernity. But the real irony, the Victorians who invented the myth were far more obsessed with controlling sexuality than medieval Europeans. While knights and ladies navigated complex courtship rituals, it was 19th century society that pathologized desire, locking up more minds than bodies. As we leave behind these fabricated chains, our next stop takes us from fake medieval gadgets to an even wilder conspiracy: the shadowy hand of the Illuminati in the French Revolution. Now, let's unravel another tangled web of historical fiction, the idea that the Illuminati orchestrated the French Revolution. This conspiracy theory paints a picture of shadowy puppet masters pulling strings behind the chaos of the late 18th century, but the timeline alone shreds that narrative to pieces. The real Bavarian Illuminati, founded in 1776, was a small Enlightenment-era society focused on secular ideals and opposition to religious influence in politics. Far from a global cabal, it barely outlasted a decade. By 1785, the group had been banned and dismantled by Bavarian authorities, its members scattered or imprisoned. The French Revolution, meanwhile, didn't ignite until 1789, 4 years after the Illuminati ceased to exist. So how did this myth take hold? Blame 19th century panic and a dash of creative paranoia. In the aftermath of the revolution, conservative writers like Augustin Barruel and John Robison spun tales of secret societies overthrowing monarchies, stitching together the Illuminati, Freemasons, and Jacobins into a single, sinister force. Their books became bestsellers, fueling fears among European elites desperate to explain the upheaval. Never mind that the real Illuminati had no ties to France, no documented meetings with revolutionaries, and no surviving influence by the time the Bastille fell. The legend thrived because it offered a simple villain for a complex event, one rooted in economic strife, Enlightenment ideas, and decades of political mismanagement. Here's the clincher: not a single primary source links the Illuminati to revolutionary leaders. Robespierre, Danton, and Marat left mountains of writing, yet none mention the group. Even Louis XVI's secret police, who tracked real and imagined threats obsessively, never flagged the Illuminati as a danger. Modern historians universally dismiss the connection, noting that the revolution's causes crop failures, tax inequality, and a bankrupt monarchy require no shadowy handlers to explain. The irony: the Illuminati's actual goals, education, meritocracy, and anti-clericalism, were shared by many revolutionaries, but that's a case of parallel thinking, not conspiracy. The myth endures because it's seductive. It swaps messy historical forces for a tidy, dramatic plot. But reality is rarely that simple. As we step away from secret societies, our next stop takes us to the American frontier, where another myth about the untamed West crumbles under scrutiny. Shifting our focus from secret societies to wide-open plains, let's tackle one of the most enduring myths about the American frontier: the idea that the Wild West was a lawless, untamed wasteland. Hollywood loves to paint this era with saloon brawls, outlaw shootouts, and vast stretches of wilderness untouched by civilization. But the truth: the West was wild for a far shorter time than pop culture suggests, and by the late 19th century, it was already being reshaped by modern infrastructure and governance. Take railroads, for example. By the 1870s, networks like the Union Pacific and Central Pacific had stitched the continent together, bringing not just people but also order. Towns sprang up along these routes almost overnight, many with organized law enforcement, newspapers, and even public schools. The telegraph followed close behind, linking remote outposts to the rest of the country. Suddenly, news traveled faster than a galloping horse, and criminals like Billy the Kid became infamous precisely because their exploits could now be broadcast nationwide, not because they were the norm. Federal governance played a huge role, too. Contrary to the lone sheriff trope, the U.S. government was deeply involved in taming the West. Federal marshals patrolled territories, courts were established, and land disputes were settled through legal channels, not shootouts. Even iconic, lawless towns like Dodge City had strict gun control laws, famously requiring visitors to check their firearms at the city limits. The myth of an untamed frontier took hold thanks to dime novels and later Western films, which exaggerated isolated incidents into a universal narrative. In reality, many parts of the West were more orderly than eastern cities of the same era. Cattle drives, often romanticized as freewheeling adventures, were tightly organized businesses with contracts and schedules. Mining towns, while rough around the edges, had elected officials and civic associations. Here's the twist: the very technologies and systems that civilized the West also fueled the myth. Railroad companies promoted the idea of an untamed frontier to attract settlers and investors. Newspapers sensationalized conflicts to sell copies. By the time the Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill Cody toured the world in the 1880s, the era they were dramatizing was already fading into legend. So why does this misconception stick around? It's a classic case of nostalgia mixed with storytelling flair. The reality of paperwork, land grants, and telegraph lines isn't as thrilling as a high-noon duel. But history, as always, is messier and more interesting than the myth. Next up, we're peeling back the veneer on another idealized era, the supposedly idyllic 1950s. Now, let's turn the page to a decade often draped in nostalgia, the 1950s. Popular culture would have us believe this was a golden age of picket fences, harmonious families, and endless prosperity. But peel back the layers of those glossy TV reruns, and you'll find a far more complex reality. First, let's talk about poverty. While shows like Leave It to Beaver depicted middle-class comfort, nearly 1 in 4 Americans lived below the poverty line in the 1950s. Rural areas, in particular, struggled with stark inequality. Farm families often lacked electricity or running water, and migrant workers faced grueling conditions for meager pay. Even in booming suburbs, many households relied on a single income, leaving little cushion for emergencies. The American dream was out of reach for millions. Then there's racial segregation, a glaring omission from those sanitized sitcoms. Jim Crow laws enforced strict divides in schools, neighborhoods, and public spaces across the South, while redlining policies in northern cities blocked black families from homeownership and economic mobility. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum precisely because the era was anything but tranquil for marginalized communities. Iconic moments like the Montgomery bus boycott and the integration of Little Rock schools were born from systemic injustice, not the harmony portrayed on screen. And what about the so-called traditional family? Divorce rates were actually climbing in the 1950s, up nearly 50% from the previous decade. Behind closed doors, many marriages strained under societal pressures to conform. Women, often confined to domestic roles, increasingly sought fulfillment beyond homemaking, planting the seeds for the feminist movements of the 1960s. Meanwhile, mental health struggles, from anxiety to alcoholism, were rarely discussed openly despite affecting countless households. So why does the myth of the idyllic 1950s endure? Partly because media of the era, from advertisements to sitcoms, sold a carefully crafted fantasy. These depictions weren't just entertainment, they were propaganda, promoting consumerism and Cold War ideals of stability. Over time, nostalgia polished those images into a collective memory that overshadowed the decade's grit and inequality. The takeaway: history is rarely as simple as reruns make it seem. The 1950s were a time of progress and pain, innovation and injustice, proof that no era is ever just one thing. And with that, we've reached the end of our myth-busting journey. But before you go, don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed unearthing these hidden truths, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold stories. See you in the next video, and there you have it, 30 historical misconceptions, debunked one by one. From the myth of the unsinkable Titanic to the exaggerated darkness of the Middle Ages, we've uncovered how these falsehoods took root and why they stubbornly persist. But here's the real question. Why does any of this matter? Because history isn't just a collection of dates and events. It's the lens through which we understand ourselves and the world. When we believe distorted versions of the past, we risk misunderstanding the present. Think about how the myth of the lawless Wild West shaped America's self-image as a land of rugged individualism, or how the sanitized nostalgia of the 1950s still influences debates about family and progress. These misconceptions aren't harmless. They shape policies, fuel stereotypes, and even divide communities. By questioning them, we're not just correcting trivia, we're reclaiming a clearer, more honest view of humanity's journey. So what's the next step? Stay curious. The next time you hear a well-known fact about history, dig deeper. Ask who benefits from that narrative, what evidence contradicts it, and why it's been repeated so often. History is a living conversation, not a static set of truths, and who knows, you might stumble upon another myth ripe for debunking, maybe even one we missed today. That's where you come in. Drop a comment below with the historical misconceptions you've encountered. Did you once believe the Great Wall of China was visible from space? Or that Marie Antoinette really dismissed the poor with cake? Share your favorites and let's keep the myth-busting going. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's hidden truths, don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next exploration, because history is full of surprises and we're just getting started. Thanks for watching, and remember, the past is never as simple as it seems. See you in the next video.